Hey guys, this is the second half of Chapter 6 review for American History 1. So let's get into it. British efforts to fix the debt crisis. If you guys remember, the most important thing about the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, for our purposes, is how it relates to the eventual American Revolution. Now keep in mind, nobody knows a revolution is coming, but when we're looking back and trying to analyze what led to it, what contributed to it, the debt that the British was in was tremendous, and it compelled the British government to look for ways to make money to pay off the debt. Where did the debt come from? Well, it came from winning the massive 7 Years' War. If you wanted to boil down, what did the 7 Years' War have to do with the eventual American Revolution? Well, debt. That's the big answer. So British debt was becoming increasingly severe in the 1760s. The British government, the first Lord of the Treasury was George Grenville at this point, and he had to devise ways to fix this problem eventually. Otherwise, the British economy would collapse, and that's a big deal. That's a big thing. So the British government noticed that Britain was actually losing money from its colonies in North America. And if you remember, the whole point of colonies was to make money for the home country, to enrich the home country. As the British they don't have to do much analysis. They know this from history, but as they analyze, what exactly is going on, they see the same old culprits: bribery, tax evasion, other forms of corruption. All these things are going to drain revenue needed to pay off all this debt. As a result of this, the Sugar Act will be passed. And it's passed to bring in badly needed revenue, primarily by curbing illegal trading of molasses. One thing that sort of throws people off with this whole thing is, a lot of times people think about the American Revolution, they say, oh, the taxes were just so high and they weren't being represented. The Sugar Act was actually lowering of taxes significantly, in half actually. So how's that going to bring in more revenue? This is due to the fact that the real problem was that nobody was paying the tax to begin with. There was a tax, no one was paying it, so tax evasion. So the Sugar Act, yes, it would lower the tax, but it would also require that ships be searched and people arrested and tried in military courts if they were found to be breaking any laws. So in this particular situation, justice was swift, and there was very little oversight compared to regular civilian courts. So the emphasis with the Sugar Act was enforcement of already existing anti-smuggling measures. It was meant to make it more realistic that the British could bring in some money. The lowering of the tax was meant to sort of offset the anger caused by a little bit more arbitrary means of justice. So when we talk about like admiralty courts or military tribunals, that is the type of thing that's being introduced in order to make sure that people pay what they owe. Now, other acts are going to be passed, of course, from the British perspective, from the Parliament perspective. These are just common sense. The Quartering Act. This is another act that required colonial communities to make reasonable accommodations for British soldiers. Because again, the argument was, well, the soldiers are there for you to protect, so you need to help take care of them. And that wasn't as extreme as it may seem today. That was something that was relatively common at the time. The Stamp Act, this placed a new tax on legal documents, newspapers, farmers' almanacs, which were very important. So farmers' almanacs were very important because agriculture was overwhelmingly the number one way that people made a livelihood. They did not have Doppler radar, believe it or not, and so there were books that were published that would predict weather, basically provide things that were useful to farmers, which is most everybody. So putting a tax on these hits a lot of people. College diplomas, even playing cards. This tax was probably not the most intelligent way to gain revenue without causing too much disruption. If you think about it, and actually John Green in his great Crash Course U.S. History makes this point specifically, but the worst people that you could possibly piss off are lawyers and newspaper publishers. Because if you think about it, who has the most influence? Newspaper publishers, for obvious reasons. They're going to print the freaking news, and they're going to tell people their opinion about how the tax is wrong. People who were accused of disobeying this act and the others were subject to military courts, which had no jury of peers, no appeals. So an important thing to keep in mind with all this, it sounds like a wave of new oppressive measures that were, you think about Robin Hood and the tax collector. You have your stereotypical scene where the poor tax-oppressed people are having every penny taken from them. Not quite the case here. British subjects back in Britain were taxed more than this significantly. And what I mean is, after all these additional taxes, they were still paying less than subjects in Britain. Or it wasn't primarily about how much people were being taxed. It was restrictions, it was principle, it was more complicated. We'll get into that. So this was not an additional tax that only colonists had to pay. Even when counting all the new taxes, American colonists had less of a tax burden than their counterparts on the British mainland. Now, many Americans began to believe that these taxes, and of course the courts that are set up to enforce them, were going against their natural liberties, a concept that only gained traction somewhat recently in American history. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Go back to the Enlightenment a little bit. We covered it. It's something that happened previously, but there's a couple of important philosophical things I want to make sure everybody's good on. Thomas Hobbes, he was around from 1588 to 1679. He was an English philosopher, and he wrote a lot. He was a philosopher, and that's what philosophers do. Right. But he wrote several works on the logic of human nature and government. Now, Thomas Hobbes, he was one of the early contributors to the concept of natural rights. The more complex assumptions that we have about inalienable rights and natural rights, those are going to be developed on top of what Thomas Hobbes established. So what Hobbes established is definitely not as idealistic as some of the things stacked on to his ideals. So we're really just talking about Thomas Hobbes to establish that this whole idea of a natural right hasn't always been there. Natural rights were said to be rights that did not have their source in laws or society, but instead came from nature itself. And the reason that's significant is what we see is a beginnings of two possible interpretations of rights. Before, everyone considered a right to be like a legal right. The king decides what your rights are, so your rights are things you're allowed to do. Well, Thomas Hobbes is going to argue that natural rights are distinguished from legal rights. Like I said, they come from nature itself. Hobbes argued that natural rights with no laws basically were just whatever a person had to do or thought they had to do to survive and prosper, or maybe even just impress others. Basically just, you hear the law of the jungle, whatever it takes. And so Hobbes argued that natural rights by themselves weren't enough to promote a healthy, long existence for human beings. So that the whole idea on civilization and having a government, obviously you're less free, but the idea is you're balancing out freedom with your natural rights. So you voluntarily give up some natural rights. So really, Hobbes was more commenting on the relationship, like I said, between human nature, logic, and government. So the most important part of all that is Hobbes argued that laws were different than rights, or at least natural rights were different than legal rights. Rights were what humans were inclined to do based on their nature, and laws were set up by a sovereign power in order to promote well-being. And so there was supposedly a balance that you should find. And so again, so many natural rights had to be surrendered in order to promote a happy, productive existence. Obviously, that sounds far removed from American revolutionary ideals, so now we're going to get closer to that. But before you get those ideals, you sort of have to stack them on top of the concept of natural rights. If nobody even thought that there were rights beyond the scope of the government, then you can't start critiquing which rights the government should give you. An Englishman named John Locke, he's going to add a few assumptions to the basic concept of natural rights, and Locke's philosophy will be very popular with American colonists. He's going to argue that life, liberty, and property, not the pursuit of happiness. That sounds a lot better. It will be changed later in the Declaration of Independence. But anyway, life, liberty, and property, that these were inalienable rights or natural rights that people had. Inalienable just means that you cannot separate those rights from a person, that they're always there no matter what. Obviously, that's an assumption. That doesn't exist in reality. In fact, rights don't exist in reality. It's a construct or an assumption. The biggest thing about this Lockean concept of natural or inalienable rights was that government should only exist if it can protect your rights. The idea that government should exist for its own reasons and it would be nice if it would protect your rights, Locke said no. That government should be based on consent. And it sounds like a basic thing, but it is a majorly important thing. To have government based on consent, that means that if people don't want a government or they don't think the government is doing a good job, then the government should not exist. It should be either changed or gotten rid of and replaced. Locke also argued that the reason that property was stuck in there, the argument was that private property is the only way to guarantee liberty. That, saying you're free, if you don't really own anything, you're still subject to whoever, you're renting from, or whoever is loaning you out whatever possessions you have. So this is a specific idea that private property is freedom. It protects freedom. That's what your freedom is based on. And so the extension of this idea is that people should not be taxed by a government if the government is not legitimate. And so therefore people should be able to consent to their own taxation. A trial by jury was also considered a natural right by most American colonists. So the fact that the Stamp Acts were passed without direct representation and the Act's enforcement was carried out with military tribunals, no juries, this is going to cause anger to build up in the colonies. Next section, post-war recession. And many times when a country engages in a war, it spends much more money buying supplies or weapons. When more supplies are bought, businesses can do much better. But after the 7 Years' War, Britain had racked up so much debt, it had to abruptly stop its spending. And so businesses who had become accustomed to that are going to be hurt. Maybe a business expands to meet more demand. And remember, the 7 Years' War lasted for years, 9 years in North America. There's going to be a surplus of goods, and it's going to lead to a recession. Things have to even out. So this is going to cause added stress and suffering on many American colonists. And because these taxes and new regulatory measures hit right at the same time of this stress and suffering from the recession, it's just going to compound the negativity. But the English government felt that it was fair and really that it had to be done. So organized resistance is the next topic. Now, though the American colonies had been famous for their lack of cooperation on many issues, that's going to change as tension mounted. Influenced by the ideas of John Locke, different colonial assemblies are going to pass what are known as resolves. And a resolve is like a non-binding declaration by a government body. These resolves are going to claim the power to tax strictly for themselves. Now, early on, the earlier resolves that were put together were intended to be crafted carefully so as not to seem inflammatory. What's going to happen, though, as word spreads, rumors spread, bad newspaper reporting, that those diplomatically worded resolves were in fact more inflammatory than they really were. In other words, when other American colonists found out about the resolves, the information they were receiving made it seem like the resolves were more in your face, more abrasive. And because a lot of the people who found out about this, they were inspired by such bold action, they were convinced that they should act in solidarity with the earlier resolves. Now remember, I said that the earlier resolves, they weren't that inflammatory, at least they weren't designed to be. And so the resolves that were made in order to show solidarity with the original resolves were therefore much more inflammatory, and so sort of by accident or false information, fake news, they're going to have the overall effect of being more inflammatory than they originally intended to be. And so that's just going to escalate the tension between colonists and the British Parliament. So the colonies are going to band together. They will petition the English Parliament to repeal the Sugar and Stamp Act. There's going to be some minor violence and destruction as a result of this resistance. There's going to be mobs. Nothing too serious. Nothing like the freaking Revolutionary War or anything. So let's talk about the British response. Now, you might all be expecting the British to respond heavily, and that's going to cause a escalation cycle. But no, actually, the Stamp Act will be repealed by the British government, but Parliament made it clear that they did have the right to tax the colonies if Parliament decided it was fair and necessary. And this is the Declaratory Act. And so basically the Declaratory Act is, well, we're going to get rid of this, but we don't have to. And if we want to tax you, we can. So by 1767, the British government again found it necessary to increase revenue because that debt problem isn't going away. So they're going to pass what are known as the Townshend Acts, and these are taxes on lead, paint, paper, glass, and tea. And the issue came to a collision point when New York refused to cooperate on that old Quartering Act. So the Quartering Act wasn't new, but it was sort of a straw that broke the camel's back, caused New York to say, Quartering Act, we're done with that. And the Quartering Act disproportionately affected New Yorkers. So the British wanted New York to supply the cost of housing for troops who had fought in the 7 Years' War and who were also there to prevent the French from taking back over. But New York is going to protest. And the British government is going to hold firm. They're going to actually suspend the New York Assembly, and they said, you will not meet until you comply. So, escalation. Colonial resistance grows. As colonists become more vocal and conspicuous in their resistance, the British government and customs officials become more annoyed and harsher in their actions. Riots, protests, destruction of property, physical abuse of British administrators. That's going to convince Britain that it needed to send troops to force some of these unruly colonists to behave. Now, as more British soldiers, aka redcoats, poured into places like Boston, especially, Boston was a hotbed of misbehavior from the British perspective, colonists felt more and more like they were being bullied and mistreated. And so finally, colonists, they're going to become somewhat tightly organized in their resistance. American merchants are going to be pressured to refuse the importation of British goods, and the goal there was to hurt the British economy. And when I say pressured, we're talking about things like tar and feathering, threatening families, some pretty dirty stuff. So some people would comply, some people would only require like an argument, and then others would require downright threatening and physical violence. So there's a scale, a sliding scale. Each month, the number of colonists who are angry and are willing to resist the British grows. And now when I say resist, I don't mean break away yet, not yet. That's coming, but not yet. We're going to talk about the Boston Massacre and the Gaspee Incident. So the situation in Boston reached a point where confrontation between redcoats and Bostonians was common. Shouting, cursing, throwing objects, including poop, of course. Now finally on March 5th, 1770, a crowd gathered to heckle 10 soldiers guarding a customs house. As I said in class lecture, this type of thing was normal. Heckling British soldiers, throwing stuff at them, screaming obscenities at them. This situation was tense. This particular situation got especially tense. In fact, so intense that after a British soldier was likely hit in the face with an icicle or a rock, something that broke the skin and made him bleed, the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 people. Now, there's a lot of controversy exactly what happened, who's to blame, but 5 people did die. Anyway, many American colonists, like, of course, Samuel Adams, the beer guy, he wanted to advance the fight against the British anyway. He and others are going to sensationalize this event as much as they could in order to whip up popular hostility. Now, when I say sensationalize, I'm not discounting the significance of killing 5 civilians, okay? What I'm saying is that what actually happened was not reported. The nature of what happened, you can imagine, British soldiers walking through a crowd, some child made an insult and they decided to mow everybody down. That there was a lot of sensationalist, intentionally inaccurate reporting to get people fired up. Because if there's anything that causes people to react, it's emotion. And so anyway, guys like Samuel Adams wanted to make sure they got the most mileage out of the situation. So in the weeks and months following the Boston Massacre, the British Parliament, for more reasons than just a massacre, but definitely had something to do with it, the British Parliament is going to repeal all the taxes, except for just 2, to try to calm things down, a tax on molasses and tea. Now, this serious reduction in taxation would reduce outward hostility in the colonies for a while, but for the next 2 years, colonists were still frustrated about the admiralty courts, the soldiers, and the remaining 2 taxes. But an unplanned act of hostility will reawaken unrest in the colonies. In 1772, a British military vessel was chasing down a smuggler, not an uncommon thing yet. Now, in the pursuit, the British ship ran aground, so it got stuck. Now, after it was stuck, I have here in my notes, and I'm going to just stick with what I've got, a group of dumbasses celebrated by burning the ship. Now, the British used admiralty courts to punish those responsible, and probably some that weren't. And of course, that's just going to anger many colonists. So that controversial situation, it's going to convince British Parliament that they're dealing with a bunch of crazy rabble. The response is going to convince more moderate, we'll call them Bostonians or colonists, to dislike the British. So it just adds to tension. And so in that context, then we talk about the Boston Tea Party. Resistance leaders in Boston will convince a large group to attack British merchant ships and dump 10,000 pounds, like British pounds sterling at the time, of tea into Boston Harbor. Now, at this point, the British government sensed that the American colonists were not just complaining about the taxes and about government procedure. It appeared now these colonists, these rebels, were denying the English government the right to govern. And so this is when we get the Coercive Acts, which are, you can tell by how they're named, the most severe responses from the British government yet. Now, the British had decided they're going to turn the heat up on Boston. The port was closed, which is a big deal. That's devastating for local businesses. And Boston was ordered to pay for all the tea that they had wasted. It was a lot. Laws were made more strict. The Massachusetts colonial government was put under the king's control. Now, many colonial governments and leaders began to wonder at this point, how far are we willing to let this go? Is this where, independence maybe? How far are we going to go? First Continental Congress. Now, I'm going to quote your book on this one. As your book states, as the delegates settled down to business, their aim was to reach agreement on 3 key points. 1, how were they to justify the rights they claimed as American colonials? 2, what were the limits of Parliament's power? 3, what were the proper tactics for resisting the Coercive Acts? Now, to the first question, Congress agreed that Americans had natural rights, which were to be protected under the British Constitution. The second question, they agreed that British Parliament only had the right to regulate commerce with regard to the empire, but not tax the colonies or require soldiers to be quartered against the demands of each colony. And the third question was answered by the establishment of a Continental Association, which would boycott certain British commerce and organize other forms of political resistance. While these measures were interpreted by American colonists to be conciliatory, so not inflammatory, British Parliament did not see it that way. And the King, George III, he just declared that the colonies were in rebellion. He was like, that's it. They're rebels. Whether they think they are or not, they are. At this point, the king decided either the colonies they're going to submit or there's going to be war. So many colonists were fine with this. Remember, there was a minority of them who had been pushing for rebellion for a long while now. But there's still going to be an element of, we'll say, moderates who are still trying to figure out a middle path. Not quite rebellion, but also standing up for their natural rights as they see them. So the next section, Lexington and Concord. Now, at this point, loyalists, those who did not agree with a rebellion, they're going to be more aggressively mistreated. They're going to be tarred and feathered, which sounds like a joke, but it's torture. It's literally a bad form of torture. You're talking about third-degree burns, skin separating from tissue or other tissue. Not a practical joke. It's a form of torture. But anyway, the Continental Congress urged the colonies to form militias for a possible military confrontation. This is where we get Minutemen from. Be ready. In a short amount of time, a minute. But the British were confident that a short series of victorious battles, from their perspective, would shut up the whiny colonists once and for all. But on April 14th, 1775, orders came from the king or from British Parliament to the Massachusetts governor, his name was Thomas Gage, to basically go suppress this rebellion, use force if needed. And so Gage, he came up with the idea, all right, Sam Adams, he's got a loud mouth, let's capture him. He was an influential and radical rebel. John Hancock, this is before he was known for his massive signature, and basically go out, capture Sam Adams, capture John Hancock in Lexington, Massachusetts, and then go over and destroy the militia supplies in Concord. Now, a force of 700 redcoats is going to be sent out from Boston. This is where we get the whole Paul Revere and William Dawes. They're going to be sent out to warn colonists. The British are coming, the British are coming. Now, the first battle of the Revolution, it wasn't much of a battle. There's a group of about 70 militia. They lined up in the road as a protest. The British told them to disperse. There's many accounts and analysis that suggest that they did begin to disperse, the militia, but there was a single musket that was fired, to which the British returned fire, and that killed 8. And this is going to send the resistance into a frenzy. It's all, revenge. Of course, this exchange of fire disperses the militia. The British continue on their way. They destroy, or they try to capture supplies. They try to capture Sam Adams and John Hancock. They don't find them. And then at a certain point, enough militia get together really spontaneously and just start taking pot shots from the trees and from behind walls and things like that. And so on the way back to Boston, groups of colonists fired upon the British, and they were still marching in formation. They were unable to really defend or respond to this sort of attack, which of course at that point was judged to be cowardly by the laws of war. The powerful countries decide what's cowardly and what's acceptable, by the way. That's the way it works. The British suffered around 250 dead and wounded before they returned to the safety of the harbor, Boston Harbor. Now, by the next day, nearly 25,000 militia had gathered, basically to put British-controlled Boston under siege. And so at this point, it's official, we've got a rebellion. Now, these military confrontations meant that resistance was now war. There was an important pamphlet authored by Thomas Paine. It's called Common Sense. Over 100,000 copies will be distributed. And in this, and the reason it matters is Thomas Paine had articulated a new way to think about the confrontation with the British. So it's no longer a series of protests against their own government, the British government, their British subjects. This was now a crusade to end oppression and tyranny and to establish a new government for a superior way of life. So the core idea of the United States of America had been born.